In 2001, director Zakiris Kunik released his Atanarjuat film, also known as The Fast Runner. It was produced by Aglula Kusuma Productions and financed by the National Film Board of Canada. The objectives in this lecture are to look at a summary, what it is, what it does, very briefly. Then I summarize the film. I've also included a review and a summary from Roger Ebert that I thought you might be interested in reading. I want to consider audiences and their perspectives. I want to look at, I think about 3 or 4 scenes in the film itself, very briefly, very briefly, go over paratext and fourth cinema. So summarizing is a common activity or a common assignment in university courses, and it refers to merely summarizing a piece of material, whether it's a film, a book, a poem, a television series, or a television episode. Or often you'll see it at work where, if your boss can't make a conference, he might ask you to summarize the activities in the conference. Or we see it in our personal lives when, a friend will say something as simple as, what did you think of that TV series? Or what did you think of that movie? Or what is that movie about? So we see it within personal lives, at work, and of course in university. For university assignments, there are 3 main requirements. A summary should cover the thing as a whole. So you don't summarize a part of it, you summarize it in its entirety. The material should be presented in a neutral fashion, and that just means simply you aren't responding to it. You are not saying what you think or what you feel or what you've discerned about it. You are merely saying this is what this material is about. It should be a condensed version and also presented in your own words. There are not normally any verbatim quotations in summaries. And that verbatim quotation just is a fancy way of saying word for word quotations. Summaries are normally quite short, like a paragraph. So this is just a summary I wrote for Atanarjuat, and so I'll just quickly read it. In the ancient days of the Eastern Arctic, a shaman creates a conflict between 2 families that are part of a nomadic Inuit community. Conflict, jealousy, and scorn disrupt the needed partnership and harmony between 2 families and the community by extension. The discord continues into the following generations and is carried by their sons, 2 brothers, Atanarjuat, and I believe this is pronounced, I have problems with this one, I think it's Amakiak or Amakuak. Atanarjuat and Amakuak of one family confront the son Oki of the other. When Atanarjuat wins Atuat in marriage despite her being promised to Oki, Oki seeks revenge. Atanarjuat survives but must flee naked across the tundra and sea ice. He struggles with the natural and supernatural world but eventually returns to his community bringing peace and harmony. And then I've just included, and it's fairly long, but Roger Ebert. He is a very famous film critic, and he just reviews and summarizes The Fast Runner. I'm just going to read this first little bit because I think it's quite interesting. We could begin with the facts about The Fast Runner. It is the first film shot in Inuktitut, the language of the Inuit peoples who live within the Arctic Circle. It was made with an Inuit cast and a 90% Inuit crew. It is based on a story that is at least 1,000 years old. It records a way of life that still existed within living memory. Or we could begin with feelings. The film is about romantic tensions that lead to tragedy within a small, closely knit community of people who depend on one another for survival, surrounded by a landscape of ice and snow. It shows how people either learn to get along under those circumstances or pay a terrible price. Or we could begin with the lore. Here you will see humans making a living in a world that looks to us like a barren wasteland. We see them fishing, hunting, preparing their kills, scraping skins to make them into clothing, tending the lamps of oil that illuminate their igloos, harvesting the wild crops that grow in the brief summertime, living with the dogs that pull their sleds. Or we could begin with the story of the film's production. It was shot with a high-definition digital video camera, sidestepping the problems that cinematographers have long experienced while using film in temperatures well below zero. Its script was compiled from versions of an Inuit legend told by 8 elders. And then we've also known this, we've gone over the success of the film. So um, this is um, this is Roger Ebert's beginning. I think that's really interesting. I think he covers a lot. He then goes into the the actual summary, quite in depth of the film. Um, and I quite like this, and I talk about this at the end of this lecture. At the end of the film, over the closing titles, there are credit cookies showing the production of the film, and we realize with a little shock that the film was made now by living people with new technology. There is a way in which the intimacy of the production and the 172-minute running time lull us into accepting the film as a documentary of real life. The actors, many of them professional Inuit performers, are without effect or guile. They seem sincere, honest, revealing, as real people might. And although the story involves elements of melodrama and even soap opera, the production seems as real as a frozen fish. So he goes on then to talk about how well the film has been received. So I want to move on to talking about the audiences of Atanarjuat. And it's clearly a film made for and by the Inuit of Canada's Eastern Arctic. And by presenting the world to a North American white settler audience, as it always was to the Inuit, the film challenges, particularly I think in Canada and possibly the United States, the audience to see the world differently. And in all likelihood, it may challenge many people who have seen it to see the world in a very different way. Critics and scholars have suggested that there's a third audience. Arnold Kriput writes about this. An audience made up from disparate non-Indigenous cultures and metropolitan centers that is not interested or is unable to engage with the film from the Inuit perspective. This audience is by far the largest of the three, he suggests. So what seems surprising to many of these scholars is Zacharias Canuck's kind of accommodation of all audiences. He has never in any interview indicated that that the story was sort of ever meant as a teaching tool. I think it is a teaching tool, but he has never indicated that. Um, many of these scholars feel that the film is being interpreted to fit into, and they use either Western, European, white settler, whatever language they're using, like to kind of is interpreted to fit into a viewpoint. So they're kind of contention with the film are these so-called third audience, these people that engage with it and then refer to it as a modern day Nanook of the North, or a merging of the epic from Shakespeare or the Iliad with parts of Nanook of the North. And these scholars question that audiences are not, in their view, engaging with it as disruptive. Arnold Kriput goes on to write in his article published in 2007, "Meanwhile, I'm not in the least tempted to invoke the epic or ethnographic categories, to Homerize or Nanook the film. To do that, it seems clear, is certainly to establish barriers that are insurmountable." So Arnold Kriput is suggesting that if you are engaging in the film and relating it to something familiar like a Homer epic or a Shakespeare story or the very famous Nanook film, that you are placing a barrier that is insurmountable in accessing the film. I don't I really don't know if he's right or wrong, but I would ask, is it possible for the film to operate on a variety of levels for a variety of viewers? And how a person is viewing something, if it's reminding them of something else, is that necessarily wrong or incorrect? And is it an incorrect way of interacting with the film if a viewer likens it to Nanook of the North? And I don't have answers. Arnold Kriput clearly does, but I don't. I don't have answers. When I was reading his article and doing a lot of like reading and research for this lecture, I I was reminded about one of the first times I traveled in Austria, and I kept like likening it to the interior of BC. And I think that was, I was quite young at the time, but I think that was my way of making sense of the foreign, that this is, how can I make this similar? And so I wonder if that's something that people do in general, and I don't know, and I'm sorry to generalize. I don't know if that's something unique to me. I don't have an answer here. I just thought it was curious, an interesting way to kind of separate audiences. As a story about a community ravaged by outside influences, the film functions as a colonial allegory as well as a narrative about identity reconstruction in the wake of this catastrophe. So, this is a quote from Atanarjuat, the fast runner, Hundorf's article. And I actually really enjoyed this quote. I think it really kind of sums up the character of Atanarjuat, and also it's suggesting that the film can do some work in drawing attention to identity reconstruction, to allegories, to maybe breaking with colonialism. So, in considering the scenes from Atanarjuat, so I want to indicate that much of the material I read or researched on this film really wanted to examine what I would call paratext, and I'll get to that later, but anything outside the film itself. They wanted to talk about the credits. They wanted to talk about the funding for the film. They wanted to talk about, is it a response to climate change? So there was a lot of articles about all this information surrounding Atanarjuat as opposed to actually looking at the film itself. So if we consider certain cinematic scenes, beyond that scope of this is an epic reminiscent of the works of Homer, Shakespeare, or if we, don't look at it how this is related to Nook of the North, what might be revealed if we just consider certain scenes. So the phrase "I can only sing this song to someone who understands it" acts as a metaphor. And what I really liked about "I can only sing this song to someone who understands it" is that it is a metaphor for the film, because unless you speak Inuktitut, you don't understand what the character is saying. So that goes for the film, for the viewers. And of course, it's also addressing characters in the film. And there's something really magical and certainly outside the scope of my reality to that phrase. I can only sing this song to someone who understood. That kind of concept that to understand is also related to language, not just to meaning. I'm not sure if I'm phrasing this right. There are these scenes in igloos and about the construction of the igloo. And I thought these scenes were really interesting. The way they work as a group to set up the igloo. And there is that really interesting moment where Atanarjuat is like enveloped by this kind of radiant roof. These shots reappear. We see something similar in Oki and Atanarjuat's first fight, and then in their final showdown. There are scenes in the film where that play of color, that kind of palette of the film, are celebrated, particularly when we're looking at water, ice, and reflection of snow. So these scenes reveal this kind of striking aquamarine and turquoise blues. And I think that what is interesting in these kind of scenes in the home of Inuit people of that time is that complexity, that interdependentness, and the cultural norm. So seeing the sun through an igloo's roof is a culturally specific event to the Inuit and not open to other cultures. So there's a lot of ways those scenes kind of work through us. And this is again another of the igloo scenes. In bed, there are 5 figures: Atanarjuat and his 2 wives, and Amakyak and his wife. And we're seeing only hair, like their long hair, shoulders. And we're seeing like kind of like just pieces of bodies outside of the animal hides. And one of the women we realize is initiating intimacy with one of the men. And there's that moment where no one seems to react initially, which there's almost like this suggestion that this is normal behavior. And there's also that moment where no one's reacting, where it seems like it might be inviting kind of a voyeuristic pleasure, or a moment that can be read as kind of like immoral or unethical behavior of Inuit sexual relations. Like some viewers might have judgments in that kind of that pause in the film. However, very quickly the event escalates into an altercation, and also reveals the film's kind of heart or theme, which is what are the results of people embracing social transgressions and failing to properly acknowledge them. When Atanarjuat runs across the Arctic, this is obviously the pinnacle of the film. It is a major moment, and it is laden with symbolism: color, land, water, ice, nudity, vulnerability. He is barefoot, he's bleeding. It's the moment. This moment can be interpreted in so many different ways. Like, I think it's easy to interpret it as just this overwhelming loss, a loss of his brother, a loss of life, a loss of well-being, a loss of material goods. But there's something in it about taking possession, that somehow with every footfall, there's this moment of defining character, of a closeness with land in a very different way, and moving forward, like a refusal to give up. The conclusion of the film, I think, really disrupts the audience's expectations. There's this idea for the tragic hero and this outcast of Aglulik, that with all his preparations for revenge, and that he ultimately pushes that aside, pushes his individual desire for revenge aside, and actually places his community above and before himself. And in that moment, Atanarjuat chooses not to end Oki's life and instead leaves Oki's fate in the hands of the elders. Zacharias Canuck reveals, I think, the necessity of the Arctic and perhaps the Inuit people as a place and a culture that functions through individual sacrifices for the group. The past, I really believe Canuck is indicating in this, is not lost, but is actually an incredible source of guidance. And the story of the fast runner asserts that social upheaval, though traumatic, is reconcilable. So I think it's a very hopeful film and a really hopeful narrative. So if we consider the reconciliation in the film of past, present, of self and other, and of revenge and forgiveness. So I want to move on briefly to paratext. So paratext, it's a literary theoretical term, and it applies or refers to everything beyond the actual printed text of a book. So it's that any printed matter outside of the book itself, like anything on the cover, bio of the writer, the font, the picture on the cover of the book. So anything like a review of the book, anything outside of the actual material. It's of course also been applied to film. So when we apply it to film, we look at trailer, the credits, again, the font, the title, um, how the title is displayed, any interviews, clips, anything again outside of the actual story of the film. So Canuck actually uses paratext in the film, and he uses it particularly at the end um, when we look at how he introduces the film crew, and all of a sudden they are contemporary and actors, and these people are, actresses, and they're wearing different clothing, and they're in vehicles, and so on at the close of, and he does this at the close of Atanarjuat. So for many, as Roger Ebert expressed, this is all of a sudden a really shocking juxtaposition that has pulled them out of the world of the film and its story in ways I think that many viewers are unprepared for. So what did you think of that? Was it shocking for you? How did it affect you? How does paratext generally in this film affecting you? And how do you feel about Canuck actively using it? And what might be his point in using it? Is he trying to tell us something? I also want to draw your attention to fourth world cinema or fourth cinema, and that is Atanarjuat is fourth cinema. In its simplest definition, it is Indigenous filmmaking for an Indigenous audience. Not to say it can't be enjoyed by anyone, but it is made for an Indigenous audience. So, for example, the Maori fourth cinema began in the 1970s. Maoris, of course, are the Indigenous people of New Zealand. And Barry Barclay is a renowned Maori artist, filmmaker, etc. So that is concluding this lecture on Atanarjuat. If you have anything you would like to look at specifically about the film or the characters, please let me know. I know that it's a very long film. It is, I think it's near 3 hours. So I certainly didn't want to take up even more of your time with an incredibly long lecture. I think, I don't want any of my lectures to go over 30 minutes. I'd rather small pieces for you. I think they're much more easy to engage with. But by all means, please let me know if you have questions and anything you want to specifically look at. For next week, we will be looking at the diversity in Indigenous playwriting and Indigenous plays and yeah, so on. Thank you very much.